Got to hear from Rilke. Got to learn my times tables. Got to hear some amazing music. And I feel very welcome, so thank you. I'm honored, really, to be here and to take on this role and get to know all of you. So what do I want to do this morning? Before this service started, and if you're new here, you can check this out sometime. At 9 o'clock, we meet over there in another little room, and we have like a discussion. And one of the things that I've been asking kind of out loud and also to myself is a simple question: where are the elders? That's like a question I have. I watch the news, or I hear political conversations, or I read the stuff I see on Facebook, and I wonder, where are the elders? Where's the wisdom, I guess I'm asking? And that was our question this morning. What is an elder? And why do we need one? One of the things that I've noticed, especially, I guess maybe I was going to say people my age or younger, but maybe that's not even true anymore, is that you can live a fairly curated life, especially online. Like, I can choose who my friends are. I can choose what kind of, like, I don't know if you're into social media, but like Instagram feed. If I get sick of someone's posts, I just delete them. And same with the news. I remember the day before the election, I read the Huffington Post, and the main headline was, Trump's chance of winning is 1.2%. Yeah, and this is a major news media outlet. You wonder, how they can survive. Like, what would they do? What did they do 2 days after that, But you can pick and choose kind of what you want to hear, and the sources that you think know what they're talking about, which, I don't know, pushes against this question: where are the elders? Where's the counsel outside my own way of being in the world, outside my own head, outside my carefully curated Facebook feed, that the moment somebody says something, I can just block them? And I did that this week, so if that was one of you, I'm sorry if I blocked you. Where's this counsel? And one of the things that attracted me to this community the very first time I came here was sitting in that room with what I took to be elders. And I mean that also in a straightforward sense. People who were older than me. And we were having a conversation. And we were hearing one another. We were listening. And 2 weeks ago, we were talking about the stuff that was going on in Charlottesville, and someone said, well, in the 1960s, when we were marching, and I thought, oh, wait, they didn't read about that in a book. They were there. And so, I don't know, we live in a profoundly sick culture in some respects. And part of the sickness is this kind of hyper-individualization of things and of spiritual paths. And that's part of what I find attractive about being here and being with all of you, is it was like a little council of grandmothers and grandfathers. And instead of, I'm serious. You think, I'm just being straightforward here. And we were even passing around a talking stick like a council, except it was a little hearing aid microphone thing. Yeah, all that happened. So if you missed it, you missed it. And I think one of the ways out of this sickness is to begin to listen to the wisdom that is already in our culture, that is already present. And you have to hunt for it. You really do. You have to hunt for it. So how lucky that there's a place like this that would welcome such a thing. Yeah, so that's not even really what I wanted to say this morning. What did I want to say? I have a little image and story in my new book, which I saw is for sale out there. So if you want one, go ahead and get one. But if you don't, you can at least listen to this section of it. A few years ago, I gave a sermon, and I climbed this ladder in the sermon, and I stood up at the top, and I was making everyone nervous. And I was quoting a line from Thomas Merton, and Thomas Merton said, "You can spend your time, your life, climbing the ladder of success, only to realize it's leaning against the wrong wall." And I thought I was like super clever. Like, look, I've climbed a ladder and I'm saying this thing. And it turned out that was me. Like, I was in irony. I had climbed a certain ladder in my life. And in this particular case, I was up on the ladder of being a megachurch pastor. And it took me some time to realize it was just leaning against the wrong wall. So what happens when you climb a certain ladder only to realize such a thing? Well, a couple things. You can climb back down, which is very hard, and you have to go a rung at a time. And in part, that's part of my own story. I started to climb back down. And also you can get just shoved off, or maybe it's a combination of the two. But the invitation really isn't to climb higher. That's probably maybe the initial impulse. If I could just climb higher, or kind of adjust the ladder a little bit, or negotiate with it. But there is something profound about this image to me, that yes, there's a time for climbing, but you get to a certain point in your life, and you got to come back down. You got to start over again. You have to stand at the bottom and say, all right, I was wrong about some things, and now what? Which is not very popular in American culture, because we just think, just keep climbing, just keep striving, just keep winning. And if you get to the very top, you'll be the ultimate winner. But that does not seem to be the perennial tradition of every single religion that we know of. That it has to be about a death of something, or it has to involve some measure of descent, or you have to fall down off the ladder, in other words. That's just part of it. So that's part of what I've been going through over the last few years. So I'm surprised, saying such a thing out loud, that other people would say, hey, you should come over here and teach. You look like you've fallen down. Why don't you come and be part of us? So now that's personal, but there's also something transpersonal about the nature of what I'm describing. In other words, it just transcends our little individual stories. There also seems to be something collective happening. That the way we thought the world worked, the way we thought America, what we thought America was in the world, also, it seems like at times we're leaning against the wrong wall. Or we've fallen down and we're like, okay, what we thought this thing was not what we thought it was. Or suddenly our 200 years of history seem like a grand experiment, and we feel like children again. Maybe we don't know what we're talking about, even though we have weapons that seem to suggest we are the most powerful country in the world. That doesn't mean we are the wisest country in the world. So something transpersonal about falling down off the ladder too. And in some ways, I think the election is an example of a certain kind of fall. Like, wait a minute, where are we? And who are we? And what makes up this place? And what's really true? What are the things that unite? And what are the things that divide? It seems like it's just pushing. Maybe it's pushing us off the ladder a little bit. Which reminded me of a poem, and that was all the introduction to my talk. I really want to just read a poem. I'm just going to read a poem. It's already been read, this Rilke poem, and I'm going to offer some observations and reflections on this poem. And when I chose it a while ago, I didn't know there was this massive Texas-sized storm forming in the waters. So the opening line this morning just like struck me. You are not surprised by the force of the storm. You have seen it growing. Now, I'm not suggesting you go out and get cable news, but I happen to have it, which I've been glued to for the last couple days. You have seen it growing. You are not surprised by the force of the storm. You have seen it growing. And I don't know, it's like, I think Rilke is talking about the personal storms in our life. You can see it on the radar from a long way off, perhaps, and you know it's coming, and the clouds start forming. And I also mean it in the transpersonal sense. There's some kind of storm growing, and it's global now. It no longer is just about America and whether or not it's really that awesome. There's like a global kind of storm forming. But you're not surprised. You're not surprised at the force of the storm. You've seen it growing. The trees flee. Their flight sets the boulevards streaming. And you know, he whom they flee is the one you move toward. This to me is the move toward a deepening kind of spirituality, or a beginning to grow up, you might say, or turning toward the things that aren't working in your life rather than away. This is the beginning of taking your head out of the sand, or what we like to call denial, and saying, all right, this thing is coming. And Rilke says, he whom they flee is the one you move toward. All your senses sing him as you stand at the window. What could be more enlivening than staring this thing down? By the way, I'm not suggesting people should not evacuate Florida. I mean, just as a side note, all right? I'm not the governor of Florida right now. What does that look like? What does that look like personally to begin to turn toward the storm of your own life? What does that look like just communally to begin to turn toward the storms we see on the horizon? What does that look like as a country or as global citizens to turn toward these things? It's a lot easier to go hide in the basement. It's a lot easier. Another example of hiding in the basement is a very curated Facebook feed with only the people that you already agree with that you can go around liking all the time. So what storm is growing? And here Rilke takes a turn in the poem. He says, the weeks stood still in summer. The tree's blood rose. And we've just been in that season where the weeks stand still like the middle of August. Everything is just still and full. Now you feel it wants to sink back into the source of everything, which is precisely what has already started to happen if you look at the very edges of the foliage of the trees on your boulevard. It wants to sink back into the source of everything. And I think he's also pointing out this kind of like inner compass that, okay, summer, but there's a turn. There's a seasonal turn. And there's this longing to sink back into the source of all this stuff. You thought you could trust that power when you plucked the fruit. Like it's the middle of the summer and you think you know what you're talking about. And you pluck the fruit, and you can name the fruit, and you can turn it this way and that way, and you say, this is what life is about, and this is what I think, and this is the correct idea or position or whatever. Now it becomes a riddle again, and you a stranger. Now it becomes a riddle again. Life becomes a riddle again. By the way, every ancient culture we know of had a cyclical view of reality. We have a very linear industrial view of reality, and we're just like on a train and it's just slowly getting better. That's not part of ancient wisdom. Ancient wisdom had this cyclical thing. There is a time for everything, as the Bible says, a season for everything. And Rilke is talking about such a notion here, this turning back toward the source. And it feels like you're starting over again, like you're a stranger. And he goes on, summer was like your house. Summer was like your house. You knew where each thing stood. Now, this is a small enough group here. How many, I'm just curious, have been in their house a long time? Do you know where each thing is? Now. See you guys. Okay. If someone were to blindfold you, could you find the light switch in your bathroom? Probably. Summer was like your house. You knew where each thing stood. That's the way a worldview, by the way, can feel. I know how this thing works. I know where the shelves are. I know where the light switches are. I know how it works, except when it stops working. And then you feel like a stranger. I lived in Israel for a few years, and when I moved back from my family, we bought a house, a historic house, which is another way of saying a piece of junk that needs a lot of work. And we hadn't seen it before, which don't recommend following my advice or my path in this respect. So we bought a house without seeing it, and it hadn't been touched. The house was built in 1908, but it hadn't had any updates at all since the 1960s. And the great thing about it was the realtor said, watch out for this phrase, it's move-in ready. Which is another way of saying, if you want to live in the backyard, it's move-in ready. Now, what was interesting is that we didn't have a lot of money, and the only thing we could do is start to work on it. That's the only thing we could do, is start to work on it, start taking walls down, fixing things. And over the course of 8 years, I can tell you, I knew where every single thing was in that house. And I mean everything. Every pipe, every electrical line, every stud, every floor joist. I knew where each thing stood, and I knew the things that weren't standing all that well as well. And then one day, it felt like it was time to go. It's like the moment I said, I know where everything is in this house and how it works, there was a knock on the door. It said, time to leave. Summer was like your house. You knew where each thing stood. And Rilke says, now you must go out into your heart as onto a vast plain. The moment you think this, I know how this worldview works, or the moment you say, I know who I am, I've taken the Myers-Briggs test, you know? Then there's a knock on the door, and there's some vast plain that you know nothing about. He says that vast plain is in your heart. Move out into your heart as onto a vast plain. And here's the not so great news. There, the immense loneliness begins. You miss the way of the old house. Those of you who have left traditions, religious traditions, churches, there's some loneliness. I know where the light switches were in the old house, and now I'm fumbling a little bit. There, the immense loneliness begins. Someone asked me last week, we weren't talking about this poem, but they said, why does it, they were saying, I'm feeling a sense of loneliness, and I want to know, precisely did they say? if it has to be this way. And I really didn't know how to answer that because I don't know if it has to be this way. But I read this poem, and part of the answer, I think, is yes. It has to be this way. An immense loneliness. And actually, also, if you think about your own psycho-spiritual work, where you're like, no, I'm going to turn towards some things that aren't so savory, or I'm going to have a look at my own wounds. There's some immense loneliness that comes with that. Who wants to look at their wounds? Can't we just watch American Idol and be happy, But the place of gifts and wounds is this sacred territory of the heart, I think, that Rilke is talking about, wounds and gifts. So he goes on with this image. The days go numb. The wind sucks the world from your senses like withered leaves. Through the empty branches, which we'll see in about 2.5 months, through the empty branches, the sky remains. There is a kind of vastness in the sort of wilderness, I think Rilke is describing here. Through the empty branches, the sky remains. It is what you have. Be earth now. Be earth. What is he talking about? I don't know. Be earth now. Sometimes I think one of the most overlooked invitations of wisdom in the Bible is in the opening chapter. People read the Adam and Eve story and they think it's about, taking fruit and being naughty and things like this. In that opening chapter, something profound is said. From dust you came, and to dust you shall return. You are the earth. You are made up of the earth. You are as much earth as, is that a green roof? Is there grass on that roof? Okay, all right. There you are. Thirsty grasses on a roof. That's a line from Isaiah, by the way, I just remembered. Like withered grass on a rooftop. Be earth now. Be what you are. Maybe some ways Rilke's saying, return. Return to the source. Be the thing that you are. Go into that vast plain and descend and sink far enough where you can feel that you are the thing you are lying on, which is the image. Laying there on the lawn, looking up through the branches. Be earth now, he says. Be earth now. We need more people. If we're going to survive, if any of us are going to survive, or our kids are going to survive, or our grandkids are going to survive, there has to be a kind of return to the earthiness that Rilke is hinting at here. Be earth now. And evensong, he says. Evensong is the evening prayers. He doesn't say go pray evening prayers. He says you be the evening prayer. Your body be the evening prayer. Be the ground lying under that sky. And here's something that kind of pokes me in an uncomfortable way. Be modest now. Be modest now. I'd rather not be modest now. Be modest now. Like a thing ripened until it's real. I think this is very personal. Can be for all of us. Be modest now. Like a thing ripened until it's real. There is tremendous faith in a line like this. It's faith that there's some great mystery, some great storm that wants to change you, or some great storm that wants to ripen you, but it requires a fair amount of modesty, or we might use an unpopular word like humility. to let it work on you, to let it work on me, like a thing ripened until it's real. And I also think beyond the personal, the transpersonal, I don't know what's going on in our culture. And there are lots of things that make me very angry, upset, confused, sick to my stomach. Sometimes moments of hope. But perhaps also as a culture, as a community, some modesty might be in order. Like a thing ripened until it's real. Nothing forces modesty like a storm that I saw this morning stretched from Cuba, another country, to Florida. A storm the size of the state itself. Yeah, but Florida's ours. That's where we own it. That's where we vacation. That's our feel-good place. A certain modesty is required at the sheer force of the thing that we are already made of, which is nature itself. So be modest now, like a thing ripened until it's real, so that he who began it all can feel you when he reaches for you. So he or she who began it all can feel you when she reaches for you. I think this kind of humility reminds me of something. This kind of modesty reminds me of something. Two things. The first is, you've probably heard this notion, it's a Buddhist notion, that the wise person has a beginner's mind. You familiar with this? The wise person has a beginner's mind, which is funny because we think the wise person, part of us, or culturally, would suggest the wise person is someone who knows a lot, who has acquired a lot of knowledge or information. And we live in, quote, the age of information, where you have access to, like I could ask my phone something right now, like, how big is Irma, the storm?
Here's what I found on the web for how big is Irma the storm.
Okay, easy. And what would that information do for me? Now you all want to know, how big is it? We think it's about acquiring information, but there's the wisdom, I think, here is that something of the beginner's mind is like this modesty, I think, that Rilke is talking about. And what is a beginner's mind? A beginner is deeply curious. Correct? They might have values, opinions, ideas, but a beginner is deeply curious. And children are like that, which reminds me of another teacher who said something similar to the beginner's mind. Jesus, who said, unless you change and become like children, you cannot enter the kingdom of God. Now, I think that is one of the most misunderstood. I think probably all of Jesus' teachings are misunderstood by me and many others. Unless you change, you become like children, you cannot enter the kingdom of God. Well, children have a profound beginner's mind that is deeply curious about what's true and what's trustworthy and what's loving and what's not. This kind of insatiable curiosity, I think, is part of what I'm describing here, this beginner's mind. Or like St. Francis said, let us begin again, for up till now we've done nothing. I feel like that's kind of the place I'm at in life. And maybe that's a good way for us to start a relationship. Let us begin again, for up till now we've done nothing. Let's have the kind of beginner's mind that's possible, that's curious, and that's open. Open to one another, to the stories, to the wisdom that already exists in this community, in our culture, to our various paths. Tell me what it's like to be you, and I'll tell you what it's like to be me. That's living. That's humanity at its best. Tell me what it's like to be you, and I'll tell you what it's like to be me. And we could use some help along the way. I think one of the things I was curious, and it came up in our elder discussion, is that there are elders who have already gone before us, who are no longer here, who have left us a wellspring of wisdom and sayings and teachings and ideas and actions. We have places to look. So let's invite them, even if they're no longer physically here, let's invite them to the table. Let's invite them to the council. Like Lord of the Rings, we'll invite them to the council. And let's do so as best we can with a sense of modesty, so that he who began it all can feel you when he reaches for you. Thanks for listening.